Diane Miller yawned as she stared at the computer screen. Another day of checking satellite data at NASA's tracking station was almost over. The evening shift was always quiet, but she didn't mind. It gave her time to think. She took a sip of cold coffee and frowned at an unusual reading from the Mojave Desert. A small blip that shouldn't be there. She adjusted the settings, thinking it was just a glitch. The blip remained. "Hey John, can you look at this?" she called to her colleague. John Baker wheeled his chair over to her station. He was older than Diane by about 15 years, with gray streaking his dark hair. "What am I looking at?" he asked, squinting at the screen. "This signal. It's been there for 3 days. I thought it was an error, but it's consistent." John leaned closer. "Huh, that's strange. It's giving off some kind of energy signature, but it's nothing I've seen before. Should we report it?" John scratched his chin. "Let's check it out ourselves first. If we're wrong, we'll look foolish." The next morning, they drove out to the Mojave in John's dusty Jeep. The GPS led them to a remote area far from the main roads. The landscape was dry and barren, with only a few scraggly bushes dotting the sand. "It should be right around here," Diane said, checking her handheld scanner. They walked for 20 minutes before John suddenly stopped. "Look at that." Ahead of them, partially buried in the sand, was something metallic. As they got closer, they realized it was much bigger than it first appeared. Most of it was underground, but what they could see was unlike any aircraft they knew. "This isn't one of ours," John whispered. The visible part was about 30 feet long, with a smooth silver-gray surface. There were no seams or rivets, no markings, just a perfect, flowing shape that seemed to absorb the sunlight rather than reflect it. "We need to call this in," Diane said, her voice shaking slightly. Within hours, the area was swarming with government vehicles. Men in hazmat suits formed a perimeter around the object. Diane and John were questioned separately for hours before being told they were now part of a classified project. A week later, massive equipment had dug out the entire object. It was a ship, but unlike any human vessel. It was about the size of a small commercial aircraft, but shaped like a teardrop. One side was badly damaged, with what looked like scorch marks. Dr. Alan Wright, a stern-faced scientist from the military, was put in charge of the research facility that was rapidly built around the site. They named it Project Descendant. "The vessel appears to be abandoned," Dr. Wright told a room full of scientists and engineers. "Our initial scans show it's been here for approximately 15 years. The damage suggests it crashed, but the technology is so advanced that even damage, it's centuries beyond our capabilities." Diane was appointed lead engineer on the project due to her discovery. She spent her days examining parts of the ship that seemed to be a control system. "It's like they just left it here," she told John one evening as they ate in the new cafeteria. "Why wouldn't they come back for it? Even if it's damaged, the technology inside is valuable." "Maybe they couldn't," John replied. "Or maybe they didn't want to risk being discovered. Or maybe they're coming back," Dr. Wright said, appearing behind them. "Which is why we need to understand this vessel as quickly as possible." As the weeks passed, more scientists and military personnel arrived. They built living quarters, labs, and a security perimeter. The ship was moved into a massive hangar where it could be studied away from satellite observation. Diane often worked late into the night, fascinated by the alien technology. Sometimes she would just stare at the ship, wondering who had built it and why they had left it behind. She couldn't shake the feeling that this discovery would change everything. And deep down, she also couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. Because if aliens had left one ship on Earth, they might return for it someday. 6 months passed at Project Descendant. The desert facility had grown into a small town of buildings surrounded by high fences and security cameras. Inside the main hangar, the alien ship sat under bright lights, partially taken apart by careful hands. Diane wiped sweat from her forehead as she worked on a small panel near what they thought was the ship's engine. Progress was slow. Dr. Wright paced behind her, his footsteps heavy with frustration. 6 months, and we've barely scratched the surface, he muttered. The president wants results, not more questions. This technology is unlike anything we've ever seen, Diane replied without looking up. It's like trying to understand a computer when you've only ever used stone tools. Dr. Wright sighed and walked away. Diane watched him go, then caught John's eye from across the room. He gave her a small smile of support. Later that day, Diane gathered her own small team of 5 engineers in a side lab. Unlike the main team, who were trying to understand the ship's original systems, Diane wanted to try a different approach. We don't need to make it work like it did before, she told them, pointing to diagrams on a screen. We just need to make it work with what we know. Her idea was simple but bold. Instead of trying to repair the alien systems, they would connect Earth technology to the alien parts that still functioned. It was like building a bridge between 2 different worlds of science. Greg Patterson, a young Navy technician with a talent for fixing things, nodded in agreement. Like hot wiring a car when you don't have the key. Exactly, Diane said. Dr. Wright wants to understand everything first, but I think we can learn by doing. For the next few weeks, they worked in secret during off hours. Greg found a way to connect their computers to what seemed to be the ship's control panels. It was dangerous work. Twice, power surges almost fried their equipment. One night, when most of the facility was empty, they made a breakthrough. Greg managed to bypass what appeared to be a security system. I'm in, he shouted, drawing the others around his screen. Strange symbols flowed across the monitor, then began to change into patterns they could understand. The ship's computer was learning their language. It's some kind of adaptive system, Diane whispered in awe. By morning, they had accessed what seemed to be the ship's logs. The data was still mostly unreadable, but certain patterns emerged. They found images of the beings who had created the ship. Tall, insect-like creatures with multiple limbs and large eyes. We're calling them Braxians, Diane told Dr. Wright when they finally revealed their progress. Based on symbols we found repeated in their language. Dr. Wright was angry at first about their unauthorized work, but couldn't deny the results. The data showed the Vraxians had an empire spanning multiple star systems. The ship on Earth was just a small scout vessel, damaged in an accident. They abandoned it, Greg explained. From what we can tell, they decided it wasn't worth the risk of being detected by retrieving it. So they just left advanced technology sitting on a primitive planet. Dr. Wright asked. They didn't think we'd be able to use it, Diane said. To them, it would be like us worrying about ants finding our wrecked car. More teams were assigned to work with Diane's approach. They discovered the ship's power core was still functional, a marvel of engineering that created energy in ways they barely understood. The propulsion system, too, was intact but disconnected from the rest of the vessel. One evening, as Diane worked late in the hangar, she felt a strange vibration from the ship. She placed her hand on the cool metal surface and felt it hum with energy. "What are you?" she whispered. "And why do I feel like there's more to your story than we know?" As if in answer, the lights in the hangar flickered briefly. Diane stepped back, a chill running down her spine despite the desert heat. For the first time, she wondered if trying to wake this sleeping giant might be more dangerous than they realized. But it was too late to stop now. The world needed what this ship could teach them. And unknown to everyone at Project Ascended, they would need it sooner than anyone expected. The alarm sounded at 3 a.m., waking everyone at Project Ascended. Diane rushed to the main control room, still wearing her pajamas beneath a hastily thrown-on lab coat. Dr. Wright was already there, looking at a large screen with several other scientists. "What's happening?" she asked. Johnson Space Center called it in, Dr. Wright said, his face pale. Our deep space telescopes picked up multiple objects entering the solar system. On the screen, bright dots moved slowly across a star field. Diane counted 15 of them, moving in perfect formation. "Are they?" She couldn't finish the sentence. "We think so," Dr. Wright replied. And they're heading straight for Earth. Laura Campbell, their communications specialist, burst into the room. Her red hair was disheveled, and she clutched a tablet to her chest. "I've been monitoring all frequencies," she said breathlessly. "There are transmissions coming from those objects. They're using a language pattern similar to what we found in the ship's logs." The room went quiet. It was one thing to study an abandoned alien ship, quite another to face its owners returning. "How long do we have?" John asked. "At their current speed, 8 months," someone replied. The next day, Diane and the other project leaders were flown to Washington, D.C. for an emergency meeting. They sat in a windowless room deep beneath the White House as military generals and government officials argued about what to do. "We should try to communicate," Dr. Wright insisted. "We don't know they're hostile." "We can't take that chance," said General Howard, slamming his fist on the table. "We need to prepare for the worst." The president, looking tired and worried, finally spoke. "Dr. Wright, what exactly are we facing here?" "In simple terms, if those ships are anything like the one we found, they have technology centuries beyond ours," Dr. Wright explained. "Our best weapons would be like throwing stones at a tank. And what about the ship we have? Can we learn from it in time?" Diane leaned forward. "Sir, we've been studying it for months. We understand parts of it, but not enough to build our own version." "But what if we don't need to build our own?" It was Greg who spoke up, surprising everyone. He had been brought along for his technical expertise. "What if we use what we already have?" "Explain," the president said. "The ship's power core and propulsion systems still work. We've been connecting our systems to theirs. What if we took it a step further? What if we turned their ship into our weapon?" The room erupted in discussion. Some called it impossible, others dangerous, but the president raised his hand for silence. "Ms. Miller, you've been leading this research. Is Patterson's idea feasible?" Diane thought carefully before answering. "It would be risky. We'd be taking alien technology we barely understand and trying to repurpose it. But," she looked at Greg, "yes, I think it's possible." "Then that's our plan," the president decided. "Operation Phoenix is now authorized. Turn that ship into something that can protect Earth." Dr. Wright protested. "Sir, we should at least try to contact them first. What if they're peaceful?" Laura Campbell, who had been quietly monitoring her tablet, looked up. "Sir, I've been translating more of the transmissions. They're not peaceful." She swallowed hard. "They're talking about cleansing and removal. I think they're planning to wipe us out." The room fell silent again. Dr. Wright's shoulders slumped in defeat. 3 days later, they returned to Project Ascendant with new authority and resources. The facility expanded as hundreds of additional scientists, engineers, and military personnel arrived. The ship was moved to a larger hangar, and new equipment poured in daily. Diane stood with Greg and John, watching the activity around them. "Can we really do this?" John asked quietly. "Turn their own ship against them?" "We have to," Diane replied. "Because if we don't find a way to fight back, in 8 months, there might not be anyone left on Earth to care." Greg nodded grimly. "Then let's get to work. We've got a planet to save." Project Ascendant was now a small city in the desert. New buildings had sprung up overnight. Helicopters landed daily, bringing equipment and people. Everyone worked around the clock, knowing that with each passing day, the Vraxian fleet drew closer to Earth. Diane stood in the main hangar, looking at the alien ship. It no longer looked elegant. Wires and cables spilled from open panels. Earth computers connected to alien systems. It was like seeing a sleek race car being turned into a battle tank. "Quite a mess we're making of their pretty ship," said a deep voice behind her. Diane turned to see a tall man in a Marine uniform. His dark skin contrasted with close-cropped gray hair, and 3 stars decorated his collar. "Colonel Frank Rivera," he said, extending his hand. "I've been assigned to provide military oversight for Operation Phoenix." "Diane Miller. I lead the engineering team." Colonel Rivera walked around the ship, studying it carefully. "So this is supposed to save us all?" "That's the plan," Diane said, "though right now it's more hope than plan." "Well, Ms. Miller, hope is a start. Now let's turn it into something more." Colonel Rivera proved to be different from the other military personnel. He didn't just give orders. He listened. He spent hours learning about the ship and asking questions that made the scientists think in new ways. 1 month into Operation Phoenix, they had their first major breakthrough. Greg discovered that the ship's power core could be modified to create a directed energy beam. In theory, it could cut through almost anything. "It's like the most powerful laser you can imagine," Greg explained to Diane and Colonel Rivera. "But instead of light, it uses some kind of energy we don't even have a name for yet." "Could it destroy one of their ships?" Colonel Rivera asked. "If we can build it correctly, it could destroy a mountain," Greg replied. They set up a test in a remote canyon 20 miles from the main facility. A small piece of the alien power core was connected to a hastily built firing mechanism. Scientists and military officials watched from a safe distance as Greg prepared to activate it. "Power at 20%, he called through the radio. "Targeting the rock formation at 2 miles. Diane held her breath. This was their first real test of whether the alien technology could be weaponized. Firing in 3, 2, 1. A blinding flash lit up the desert. Then came a boom that shook the ground. Where the rocky outcrop had been, there was nothing but a smoking crater. The crowd cheered, but their celebration was cut short. Alarms blared from the test equipment. Before anyone could react, the power core piece overloaded. The explosion destroyed the test platform and killed 3 researchers who were too close. The project was nearly shut down. Families were notified. Funerals were held. An investigation began. Diane spent 3 days going over every detail of what went wrong. She barely slept, fueled by coffee and the knowledge that Earth's future depended on her finding a solution. On the 4th day, she burst into Colonel Rivera's office, where he was meeting with Dr. Wright. "I know what happened," she said without preamble. "The calibration was wrong. The alien technology uses a different energy scale than we do. We were treating it like it was linear when it's exponential." She laid out her calculations, showing how they could safely harness the power core's energy. "You're sure about this?" Colonel Rivera asked. "No," Diane admitted, "but I'm sure we'll all die if we don't try." Dr. Wright studied her work and slowly nodded. "She's right. This could work." "Then we continue," Colonel Rivera decided, but with more safety precautions. They rebuilt the test platform with Diane's new calculations. This time, they tested it remotely, with no one near the site. The beam fired successfully, even more powerful than before, and the system remained stable. That night, Diane sat outside her quarters, looking up at the stars. Somewhere up there, the Vraxian fleet was coming. They had made progress, but was it enough? Would their hybrid of human and alien technology really be able to stop an advanced civilization? A shooting star streaked across the sky, and she made a wish. Not for herself, but for everyone on Earth who didn't even know the danger they were in. 3 months before the Vraxian arrival, Project Ascendant reached a critical stage. The alien vessel no longer looked like its original self. Earth technology had been fused to it at every point. Thick cables connected to the power core. New metal plates covered the hull. A large cannon-like structure protruded from what was once the ship's front. "It's ugly," Greg said as he and Diane looked at their creation, "but beautiful in its own way." "Like a homemade sweater," Diane replied with a small smile. "Not pretty, but made with love." They had named the ship Phoenix, born again from the ashes of its former self. The inside was even more changed than the outside. The alien control systems had been partly replaced with Earth computers and screens. Chairs and workstations had been added for the human crew who would operate it. Colonel Rivera inspected the ship daily, learning every detail of its systems. He would be in command when Phoenix finally launched. "How close are we?" he asked Diane one morning. "The main weapon works. The power core is stable. The shields," she hesitated. The shields are a problem. The Vraxian ship had an energy shield system, but they couldn't fully activate it. Without shields, Phoenix would be destroyed in its first battle. What do we need? Colonel Rivera asked. More power, or a better way to distribute what we have, Diane said. Dr. Wright, who had been quietly working in his own lab for weeks, appeared at that moment. I might have a solution, he said. Despite his initial opposition to weaponizing the ship, Dr. Wright had thrown himself into the project. He showed them his design for a hybrid shield system, part Vraxian technology, part human innovation. We can't match their pure energy output, he explained, but we can supplement it with physical barriers in key areas. It wasn't elegant, but it might work. They added layers of Earth's strongest materials at the shield's weakest points. The result was a patchwork defense, but their tests showed it could withstand significant damage. As they worked, Laura Campbell continued to monitor the approaching fleet's communications. They're talking about Earth more specifically now, she told the team during a briefing. They refer to us as the infestation. They don't see us as an intelligent species, more like pests to be removed. The news strengthened their resolve. Even Dr. Wright no longer spoke of peaceful contact. 2 months before the expected arrival, they began training the crew who would operate Phoenix. Greg was chosen as chief engineer. Diane would monitor the hybrid systems. Colonel Rivera would command. 20 other specialists were selected from the military and scientific community. They ran simulations daily, learning to work together as a team. The ship couldn't fly yet. They hadn't fully connected the propulsion system, but they could test the weapons and shields. Imagine this, Colonel Rivera told his crew during one training session. We're facing an enemy that thinks we're insects. They expect us to run and hide. Instead, we're going to fly up and sting them with their own stinger. 1 month before the deadline, they finally activated the propulsion system. Phoenix rose shakily from the hangar floor, hovering 3 feet up, before settling back down. It's not pretty, Colonel Rivera said, but it flies. That night, the entire Phoenix crew gathered in the cafeteria. No one had called a meeting. They just found themselves there, drawn together by shared purpose and fear. I want to say something, Colonel Rivera said, standing up. I've been in the Marines for 30 years. I've led men and women into battle many times. But I've never been prouder than I am to serve with all of you. He raised his coffee mug to Phoenix and her crew. Everyone raised their cups in response. Later, Diane walked alone through the quiet facility. She stopped at a window overlooking the hangar where Phoenix waited. The ship looked nothing like what the Vraxians had left behind. It was no longer abandoned alien technology, but something new, a symbol of human determination and creativity. You were meant to be forgotten, she whispered to the distant shape. Instead, you'll be remembered as the ship that saved Earth. Behind her, the radar screens continued their steady sweep, counting down the days until the Vraxian fleet would arrive. The day came sooner than expected. Earth's early warning systems detected the Vraxian fleet entering orbit. 15 massive ships, each 10 times larger than Phoenix, positioned themselves around the planet. Alarms sounded throughout Project Ascendant. People ran to their stations. In the command center, screens showed the alien ships spreading out in formation. They're earlier than we calculated, Laura said, her hands flying over her keyboard. They've improved their engines since they abandoned the scout ship. A message appeared on all screens and devices across the planet. It showed a Vraxian, tall and insect-like, with multiple limbs and large compound eyes. It spoke in a clicking, harsh language that was quickly translated. Primitive species, it said. Your world is now claimed by the Vraxian Dominion. Your removal will begin in 6 hours. Resistance is meaningless. World leaders scrambled to respond. Some wanted to surrender, others to fight with conventional weapons. In the end, they all agreed on one thing. Phoenix was Earth's best hope. Colonel Rivera gathered his crew in the hangar. Phoenix sat ready, its systems humming with power. This is what we've prepared for, he told them. The plan is simple. Earth's military forces will launch a diversionary attack. While the Vraxians are distracted, we take Phoenix into orbit and attack their lead ship with our main weapon. Everyone nodded. They had practiced this countless times. I won't lie to you, Colonel Rivera continued. Our chances are slim. But remember this, they think we're insects. Let's show them just how dangerous an insect's sting can be. They boarded Phoenix. Greg took his position at engineering. Diane monitored the hybrid systems. Colonel Rivera sat in the command chair. 20 crew members manned various stations, their faces tense but determined. All systems online, Greg reported. Power core stable at 80%. Launch sequence initiated, Diane added. The roof of the hangar slid open, revealing the night sky. Phoenix rose slowly, its engines glowing with blue-green light. It wobbled slightly, like a child taking its first steps. Steady, Colonel Rivera said. Keep her stable. Around the world, Earth's military launched everything they had. Jets, missiles, even experimental space fighters. They knew it wouldn't do much damage, but that wasn't the point. They just needed to draw attention away from Phoenix. The hybrid ship climbed higher, pushing through clouds and then into the upper atmosphere. The ride was rough. Warning lights flashed on several panels. Hull stress exceeding safety limits. Greg called out. Reroute power to structural integrity, Colonel Rivera ordered. Diane made the adjustments, her fingers dancing across the controls. The ship steadied, continuing its ascent. They broke through into space. Below them, Earth was a blue and white sphere. Above, the Vraxian fleet waited like dark stars against the blackness. They've spotted us, Laura said from her communication station. They're laughing. Their communications indicate they think we're trying to flee in one of their own ships. That's good, Colonel Rivera said grimly. Let them underestimate us. Phoenix approached the largest Vraxian vessel. It was enormous, dwarfing their ship. Its surface was smooth and dark, with glowing purple lines running along its length. They're scanning us, Laura reported. They've recognized parts of their technology. They're confused. Weapons range in 30 seconds, Greg said. Charge the main cannon, Colonel Rivera ordered. All power to weapons. The front of Phoenix began to glow with intense white light. The energy built, making the whole ship vibrate. They're locking weapons on us, Laura warned. Fire, Colonel Rivera commanded. A beam of pure white energy shot from Phoenix. It struck the Vraxian ship dead center. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the alien vessel's hull began to crack. Light spilled from the cracks, growing brighter. Suddenly, the massive ship split apart, exploding in a blinding flash. Cheers erupted on Phoenix's bridge, but they didn't last long. All Vraxian ships are turning toward us, Laura said urgently. They're all targeting Phoenix. The first wave of alien weapons fire hit their shields. The ship shuddered violently. Shields holding at 60%, Diane reported. But they won't last long against concentrated fire. Colonel Rivera's face was grim but determined. We've shown them we can hurt them. Now we need to find a way to hurt them all. Phoenix shook as another blast hit its shields. Warning lights flashed across every control panel. The crew held onto their stations as the ship rocked from side to side. Shields at 30%, Diane called out. One more direct hit and they'll fail completely. Colonel Rivera studied the tactical display. The remaining 14 Vraxian ships had formed a circle around Phoenix, taking turns to fire. They were playing with the human vessel, like cats with a mouse. We need options, Colonel Rivera said. The main cannon needs 20 minutes to recharge. We don't have 20 minutes. Greg looked up from his engineering station, his face pale but determined. I might have an idea. It's crazy, but it might work. At this point, I'll take crazy, Colonel Rivera replied. Greg pointed to a diagram of Phoenix's systems. What if we connect the main weapon directly to the power core? Bypass all the safety systems. Diane's eyes widened. That would give us enough power for one massive shot. maybe enough to hit multiple ships at once. But, Colonel Rivera asked, sensing there was more. But it would almost certainly destroy Phoenix too, Greg said quietly. The power surge would overload everything. We'd have maybe 30 seconds after firing before the core exploded. The bridge fell silent. Everyone knew what this meant. How many of their ships could we take out? Colonel Rivera finally asked. If we position ourselves right, and the beam disperses as I think it will, maybe all of them, Greg replied. Another hit rocked the ship. Shields at 15%, someone called out. Colonel Rivera stood up. I need volunteers to stay aboard. The rest of you will evacuate in the escape pods. He looked at Greg. You'll need to stay to make the modifications. I'm staying too, Diane said immediately. It'll take both of us. And me, Colonel Rivera added. Someone needs to fire the weapon. He turned to the rest of the crew. The rest of you, get to the escape pods. That's an order. People moved quickly, some with tears in their eyes as they said hasty goodbyes. Laura paused at the door. It's been an honor, she said, and then she was gone. Greg and Diane worked frantically, rerouting systems and removing safety protocols. The ship continued to shake as more hits landed. Shields at 5%, Greg reported. Almost there. Got it. The weapon is directly connected to the core. Colonel Rivera nodded. Now we need to position ourselves. He took manual control of Phoenix, guiding it toward the center of the Vraxian formation. The alien ships, perhaps sensing something was wrong, began to move away. They're repositioning, Diane said, preparing for a coordinated attack. Perfect, Colonel Rivera replied. They're putting themselves right where we want them. The Vraxian ships formed a new pattern, lining up for what they thought would be a final devastating attack on the human vessel. Weapon charge, Greg announced. Ready to fire. Colonel Rivera looked at Diane and Greg. It's been an honor serving with you both. For Earth. For Earth, they echoed. Fire, Colonel Rivera ordered. A blinding white light erupted from Phoenix. The energy beam, far larger than before, shot outward in all directions. It struck the Vraxian ships simultaneously. One by one, they began to break apart, exploding in brilliant flashes against the blackness of space. As predicted, Phoenix's systems began to fail immediately. Alarms blared throughout the ship. Core overload in 25 seconds. Greg shouted over the noise. Get to the emergency escape pod, Colonel Rivera ordered. Now. They ran through the shaking corridors, reaching the last remaining pod. They strapped themselves in as the ship began to come apart around them. 10 seconds to core overload, the computer announced calmly. The escape pod launched, shooting away from Phoenix. Behind them, a hybrid ship glowed brighter and brighter, until it seemed like a new star had been born in Earth's orbit. Then it exploded, the shockwave pushing their small pod tumbling through space. Hours later, they were picked up by a rescue ship. As they stepped onto its deck, the crew greeted them with cheers and tears. Did it work? Diane asked anxiously. Are they all gone? Every last one. The rescue ship's captain confirmed. Earth is safe. In the weeks that followed, the world celebrated its unexpected salvation. Parades were held for the Phoenix crew. Memorials were built for those who didn't return. Diane, Greg, and Colonel Rivera were hailed as heroes. But perhaps the greatest change was in how humanity looked to the stars, no longer with just wonder, but with new determination. The Vraxian technology, combined with what they had learned building Phoenix, sparked a revolution in human space technology. Within a year, Earth had its first true defense fleet. Within 5 years, its first colony ship. The scrap starship left behind by aliens who thought humans were insignificant had become the seed of humanity's spread to the stars. The Vraxians had meant to destroy Earth. Instead, they had given it the universe.